the best way of looking at it is to think of, your personal income tax. So, effectively you tell the government what you're required to pay. Now, the government audits that. It's very different. In property tax assessing authority tells you what your assessment is, and that's the basis for your tax. The obligation now is on you. You're effectively the auditor. If we review 100 properties, we find approximately 40% of them have an opportunity for a significant property tax savings or a property tax refund. And, of those, the success rate is in the order of magnitude of 50%. So when you look at that opportunity for property tax savings, I think it's crazy not to review your properties and file appeals.
It's almost like the government is waiting for people to appeal, but most people just don't take them up on that offer.
In terms of how often people get engaged in this process, it's shockingly rare. It's about 1% of properties are appealed in Ontario.
1%.
About 1%.
How does that compare against other parts of Canada?
In downtown Calgary, for example, the significant majority of properties are appealed. So
Significant majority?
Significant majority.
Like well beyond 50%?
I would expect so.
So the way I'm understanding this is, if you take on this effort, you're more likely than not to succeed, and yet only 1% of property owners in Ontario are actually taking this on. So that makes me wonder, what's the other 99% leaving on the table? Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I have a very special guest with me here today. Robert Brazzell is the current managing director of the Colliers Property Tax Services in Ontario. He's been in the business and has conducted property tax assessment appeals for nearly 30 years and has held progressively senior roles in firms like Deloitte, Altus Group, and as of current, Colliers. And he's also served as the acting chair of a provincial property assessment appeal tribunal. Thank you so much for being here today, Robert.
It's my pleasure. It's kind of a dry topic often, property tax. You don't frequently get invited to these type of events or podcasts, things of this nature. So I appreciate the invitation. For me, it's an exciting topic, but I know for a lot of people, it's pretty mundane.
Yeah, it's mundane, and I feel like one of the things that tax benefits from by being mundane is most people aren't really thinking about it actively. And I think part of why I wanted to sit down with you is to make a point that it is definitely something worth thinking about, especially as a commercial property owner. And I think with that, I want to actually know, like, what drew you to tax? Because that's not something that most people are naturally drawn to. How did you decide that this was going to be your focus in your career?
Yeah, and picking up on your last observation, it's often the largest operating expense for commercial property. So, it's a very substantial expense. It probably warrants more attention than it receives, but you're right. Historically, it isn't sort of a hot topic, I would say, in the media or elsewhere. Although recently it's been more of an issue in Ontario. But I got into the business really. I was an administrative lawyer, and one of the functions, administrative lawyers obviously is appearing in front of different tribunals. I started representing taxpayers before the municipal tribunal in Manitoba, actually, that was responsible for hearing property tax assessment appeals. From that, I built a bit of a practice, administrative law practice, was doing more of that type of work. I ended up being appointed an acting chair of the Manitoba Municipal Board, which hears property tax assessment appeals in Manitoba. And from that was the start. And I've held, as you noted, a variety of positions at Deloitte, Altus, and now at Colliers. Always very specialized. Once I got into this business, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed real estate generally, but this aspect of it in particular, it seemed really like a perfect sort of combination of two things I enjoyed. One, the administrative advocacy, other it being real estate itself. And so I've done this exclusively now for, as you indicated, almost 30 years, starting sort of 10, 15 years in Western Canada. The more recent half or thereabouts has been in Ontario. So it's been an exciting space for me, and I've really enjoyed this work.
Yeah, and I actually got introduced to you not too long ago. You came into one of our meetings here at Colliers as part of the industrial team, and you shared with us what's going on currently in the world of property tax and some of your projections of what's to come, and you were basically being bombarded with questions. So it occurred to me that if brokers were engaging in this world on a daily basis have this many questions, I can only imagine that property owners who are even more removed from the day-to-day industry talk would have many more about what's going on. So could you, fill the audience in? What's going on in the world of property tax right now?
Ontario is really a unique situation for a variety of different reasons. One of them obviously is the reassessment delay. But I'll take it back a bit because really I think the transformation or the change and the reason that Ontario really is distinct in this space is starting around 2008, you had to be licensed by the Law Society in order to represent taxpayers before the Administrative Tribunal, the Assessment Review Board, which now hears property tax assessment appeals. That changed the type of service provider that was available in the market and the way it was approached and added a layer of complexity, I would say. So that was one thing. So what happened as a result of that is there was a clear bifurcation of the roles of the people that were appealing property tax assessments for commercial clients. You had the expert witness, effectively the valuators, the people who are looking at the value of the asset by the standard that was required by the Assessment Act, and then the advocates, people who actually presented the case. So that really was a fundamental transformation from the historic property tax consultant who did sort of A to Z, the entire equation, right from the valuation piece to presenting at the hearing if the appeal went to a hearing, to a situation where you had different people and different skill sets, involved in different parts of it.
Right. And what's your take on the current situation that we find ourselves in with property tax assessments being as delayed as they have been? I believe since 2016, Ontario properties haven't been reassessed. What position does that put property owners in, and what can they expect for what's to come next?
Well, like the situation with, I mentioned that bifurcation of the roles between the expert, the evaluator and the advocate when you're doing appeals, and that's a unique situation for Ontario in the Canadian context. The similar comments apply to the reassessment. Ontario was the only province that paused the reassessment due to the pandemic. Manitoba did delay their reassessment 1 year, but they were transitioning to a different cycle, different term in which that would be applicable for. I think they moved from a 3 to a 2 year cycle. So, they used that period to adjust their cycle. But Ontario, during the pandemic, paused. And the rationale was, their bigger priorities effectively while we were dealing with the pandemic. It never started again. So two things are unique about that. One is effectively that Ontario was the only province specifically to use the pandemic as a rationale for delaying the reassessment, which was meant to apply for the 2020 tax year. Or I guess it would have been based on, to back that up, it would have been based on January 1, 2020 valuation, and that would apply for tax year 2021. In any event, so there was a situation there where it was paused, didn't occur for 2021, but now we're in 2025, still no reassessment. So unique system here in terms of that bifurcation of the roles between experts and advocates, and the requirement to be licensed by the Law Society here in order to represent taxpayers before the tribunal. Unique situation in that the pandemic was used as a basis, and at the time, probably reasonably enough as a basis to delay the reassessment, but now it hasn't resumed. So a real outlier. All the other provinces have had these reassessments. Ontario hasn't, and now we're 5 years past that initial delay.
Right. So my understanding is, and in talking to you previously, when assessments get delayed as much as they have in Ontario, there's a bit of a gap between the reality of the market and where properties are actually being taxed. So would you say some properties are being overtaxed while others are being left behind?
Yeah, the overtaxation is a function of the delayed reassessment, and the explanation is simple. It's meant to be current market value, is meant to be the basis for assessment. So when you're meant to look at property at a value, in or about the tax year, or is reasonably proximate to the tax year. Now here the cycle was 4 years prior to the pandemic. We're not sure what it'll be moving out of or once the reassessment starts, but was 4 years. So you already had a bit of a gap between, the value you were using. So giving an example, the cycle it was to go 2017 through 2020 tax years was based on January 1, 2016 value. Obviously, by the time you got to 2019, 2020, you're already a bit removed from what the actual value of that property is, like,
Right.
in terms of, okay, what's it worth in 2019 in reality versus the 2016 valuation date. So there's already a bit of a disconnect. That creates issues because you're not as familiar with the market, obviously. So it's a harder sort of leap to make. Is my property overassessed? You tend to be more driven by what the market is in 2019 because that's what you're familiar with, and you have to remember it's hypothetical. You're looking at that property at at a January 1, 2016 value. So that creates a bit of an issue. The distortion comes like the longer you have a delay between the valuation date and the tax year when the taxes are imposed, because the market itself is dynamic.
Right.
So we've seen a situation where, for example, B and C class office buildings in the GTA would have, their value wouldn't have changed or increased in many cases, might have gone down in some, where, for example, distribution warehouses might have doubled or tripled in value. So what happens is that they're still being taxed based on the values that they would have had in 2016. And so now there's a much greater distortion between market value and the assessed value. So if your property has, let's say it hasn't gone up in value, but you're still being taxed, so you're still being taxed on that original value, well, that's one thing, right? In absolute terms, your tax is going up. If your property is tripled in value, your taxes haven't had that commensurate increase. So that's where there's a distortion, and arguably the office buildings are paying more than they should, and that's one example.
Right. So then going into what can these people do? Like, what are the options available to the owner of a property? Like, if I own that B-class office building in Kitchener, Ontario, right, that I've really struggled to put tenants in, while my cousin owns this distribution warehouse in the same city that has had zero vacancy, and then tenants have been paying me just rents that have been shooting through the roof, but we're still paying the same property tax. And I come to you, like, what are the options that are available at my disposal to do something about that?
Yeah, if you walked in the door today, for example, there's two basic things you can do. One is apply for a 2024 property tax refund, and the other is to appeal your 2025 property tax assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And so the refund situation typically applies to situations like space that was unusable due to demolition or fire damage, things of that nature. There's other circumstances, as long as those exist for 90 days or more, there's tax relief available in those circumstances, and that would be a refund of your 2024 taxes. And there's a variety of other situations that applies to. But the crux of it is there has to be for some reason your space wasn't usable is sort of the baseline test. The other one is a property tax assessment appeal, which is based on two things. One is your property assessed more than its market value as of January 1, 2016, and market value using sort of a mass appraisal analysis, which is what MPAC applies, the assessing authority applies. Or is it inequitable? Are you paying more than competitive property? So look at the competitive subset, and is your property in relative terms paying more tax than its peers? So either one of those situations, and more tax effectively is a proxy for assessed value, or vice versa. So when I say more taxes, because your assessment is higher typically.
So could you dig into mass appraisal for me a little bit? How does that actually work?
Yeah, the assessing authority, the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation in Ontario, which assesses, I think it's something approaching 6 million properties. They, like,
and that's residential and commercial?
Residential and commercial. They, like other assessing authorities in North America, are mandated to establish the assessed value based on a mass appraisal approach. They're not doing site-specific analysis. They're doing very broad brush analysis. I think the cost of this in jurisdictions like Ontario, BC, that have this, the central assessing authority, is around $50 a property. So that's sort of a benchmark somewhere in that vicinity. Wow. So it's nothing like doing an appraisal where you're doing a site-specific analysis, right? So inherent in that is errors, effectively. Not errors in terms of the model, might be correct in terms of what the model produces, errors in terms of what is actually the standard that taxpayers are entitled to under the legislation. and they're entitled to, really at that stage, if you appeal, a site-specific analysis. That's when you're doing sort of an appraisal level valuation of the property. And that's where you see a disconnect. And the reason there's a disconnect is because the mass appraisal sort of treats everybody as typical. So high performing properties might be brought back more towards the mean, and lower performing properties are brought up. So the lower performing, and there's some in every subset, in every market, are overassessed. So they're necessarily paying more tax than they should be. So in a mass appraisal model, it doesn't matter how efficiently, effectively, accurately you do it, there's going to be a group of properties in every competitive category, in every class, in every subset that are overassessed. So there's always opportunity to achieve property tax savings for at least some of the properties in any group.
Right. So the way I understand it, the government's assigning an average to every property, and just by nature of that, most of the properties, or half of them, are going to be paying above that mean, and paying too much, and the other are going to be below and paying too little. So what the government's basically saying is, hey, I'm going to assume what your property is worth, and you're welcome to tell me if I'm wrong. And do most people take them up on that offer and go and tell the government, hey, this is how your assessment's wrong, and help me out with that?
Yeah, it depends, how many are like effectively underassessed or overassessed. I mean, it's going to depend on the given set of properties and the situation. But the basic principle that you're working to an average is accurate, right?
Yeah.
And that's why some are, the ones that we are interested in, the ones that are overassessed. In terms of how often people get engaged in this process, it's shockingly rare. And it's a bit unusual in that Ontario, I think, more than other Canadian provinces, owners aren't participating in the appeal process as frequently. And I think there's a number of ways to explain that, or that as to why that happens. But I think the first, just to take it back, one step, it's about 1% of properties are appealed in Ontario.
1%.
About 1%.
How does that compare against other parts of Canada?
Well, anecdotally, I would say that, within certain groups, like in downtown Calgary, for example, the significant majority of properties are appealed. So
Significant majority?
Significant majority.
Like well beyond 50%?
I would expect so, of the larger commercial properties in cities like Calgary.
So there's roughly a 50x gap, is what you're saying, in percentage of people who will appeal their property tax bill between.
Well, I'm not doing apples to apples here,
Yeah.
because I'm taking, a given example, because you don't have a, one assessing authority in Alberta like you do in Ontario, so it's difficult to do a direct comparison. But, anecdotally, having worked in that market, I know that in the downtown office market, most properties are appealed. Historically.
And do they succeed in that effort?
Yeah, the success rates are quite high, overall.
So you're
in every market, assessment appeals have a pretty significant success rate. Again, it varies, right? It's hard to put a hard number on it. I know that in Ontario, it's probably in the order of magnitude of 50% of appeals resulted in a reduction. I think the most recent numbers I looked at were 2022 and 2023.
Right. So if I'm a property owner and I find out that I'm more likely than not to succeed in my effort to reduce my property tax bill if I go to the government, but I'm guessing for most people the prohibitive, I guess, cost in that is, do I want to go and hire a lawyer and go through with this whole process of achieving this? Granted, having your property tax bill lowered is a competitive advantage when you're in the market. I don't have to charge as much of a TMI on a net lease, and I get to make my property more attractive while actually pocketing more base rent as an owner. But do I want to go through with that effort and the bill that's going to come with hiring a lawyer and going into a dispute with the government?
Yeah, it's an interesting comment and interesting question, because there's a number of components to it. First of all, how does the system operate, and why would you want professional advice? And I would say the best way of looking at it is to think of your personal income tax. So effectively, you tell the government what you're required to pay. You file your return indicating what your income and related expenses, or whatever the situation is, deductions, and then tax credits, etc. And you have a number. Now the government audits that. They review it initially, They might do a lot more extensive analysis, do a full audit of that. But you're presenting that number to them as the tax you're required to pay based on your personal situation, and the government effectively has the audit function. It's very different in property tax. The assessing authority or the government, depending on the jurisdiction, but some form of a assessing authority tells you what your assessment is, and that's the basis for your tax. And that's one of the two things that determine what property tax you pay. The other, of course, is the mill rate or the tax rate set by the municipality. But the fundamental piece is, what is the assessed value of your property? And now the government is telling you what that is, or the assessing authority is telling you what that is. So the obligation now is on you. You're effectively the auditor. The responsibility is on the individual, the property owner, the occupier of the property, to test that number, because the government, again, doesn't have the information that you have about your property. And also they're using mass appraisal with the inherent limitations I discussed about the amount of money. They have to have an efficiency there, and not doing site-specific appraisals. They're effectively spending $50 a property or something in that range to come up with the value. The obligation is on you as an individual owner, occupier, to test that through an audit process. And that's why you bring in professionals. So that's why, the first step, right? I mean, you're the auditor, what are you going to do? Well, it's a pretty complicated process. Some people can manage it themselves, most can't. And it's because in there's a variety of reasons that, but I guess the fundamental one is that there's a lot of data analysis that goes into that, market data, understanding the broader market. There's the complexity of the system itself, in terms of the appeal process and everything involved in that. So, I can understand why people themselves wouldn't undertake the appeals. Maybe you do it on a residence, like your personal home, but you don't typically do it on a commercial property. And I can understand why, when you look at the nature of the process, where you have this bifurcated model where you need the valuator and you need your advocate, and it's a legal process, it's a legal proceeding. So I understand that. But the fact is, if you don't do that, you're relying on the government's number, and you're stuck with it. So I would say, there's lots of people in the market who provide property tax services. I think that in terms of the cost, probably the biggest single consideration is that most of them do it. Certainly, Colliers does it on a contingency fee basis. That's our typical model. That's how people typically want to obtain our services, which means if we don't save them tax dollars, there's no fee for our service.
There's no fee.
Yeah, and it goes beyond that. I mean, we'll do the review to identify whether or not there's a tax saving opportunity. No fee, no obligation.
Mm-hmm. So I'm guessing that you're being selective with the files you take on, where you actually feel like there's potential to get something, get a win.
Right, and as I explained, there's lots of reasons why there are opportunities, and it is driven in part by this whole mass appraisal model.
Right. So the way I'm understanding this is, if you take on this effort, you're more likely than not to succeed, and yet only 1% of property owners in Ontario are actually taking this on. So that makes me wonder, what's the other 99% leaving on the table? Like, what's potentially being left behind if you forego this process?
Right, and you'd have to determine how, of that 99%, there is that initial review process. Obviously, the rest of them aren't all going to file appeals and have a 50% success rate. So it's hard to say exactly where the breakdown would come in terms of what opportunities there are. Mm-hmm. But like, not doing a review, not doing that baseline audit, to my mind, you're eliminating any possibility of achieving property tax savings. It strikes me like there are opportunities to have these reviews done, no cost, no commitment, and see if you're one of the people, and there are lots of them out there who aren't taking advantage of property tax savings. You could be one, and you'll never know unless you have the property tax assessment of the property that you own or occupy,
right,
responsible for paying the tax for, reviewed, have that situation reviewed.
And at the same time, there's no cost to actually get reviewed, and there's no cost to you if you were to actually go through and succeed in this effort.
Yeah, there's no cost for the review and no cost in terms of a fee if it's unsuccessful. If it was determined that an appeal was warranted or the appeal wasn't successful, there's no fee charged.
Right. And what have you seen on average in terms of people being able to reduce their bills? Like, what are they able to bring it down by when they're succeeding in this effort?
Well, it's a huge range, as you'll appreciate. I mean, for example, your property could be exempt for some reason, right? Depending on the ownership and the use of the property, perhaps you're not required to pay property tax. It could be not assessable. The impact could have assessed an asset on your property that isn't subject to assessment. There shouldn't be property tax associated with it. These are dramatic changes. From you go to zero effectively in some situations. More typically, you're looking at adjustments, right? 10, 15, 20% adjustments to your property tax.
And you add that up over years and years of paying those taxes until the next assessment, and that's significant savings for not a huge change in your operations, for really just telling the government that, hey, I think you might have been wrong in your assessment. And
yeah, and there's nothing necessarily antagonistic about this sort of approach, right? I think the system is set up so that the understanding is that taxpayers have an opportunity to have their property tax assessment reviewed, appealed, reduced. That's built into the system. It's a basic right that taxpayers have. So, yeah, absolutely. You're just exercising your right as a property owner to review it and, where appropriate, have it reduced. It's very straightforward. And as I said, it doesn't have to be a antagonistic type of situation. It's just built into the mechanism and built into the property tax system.
right, it's almost like the government is waiting for people to appeal, but most people just don't take them up on that offer.
You characterize it that way. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. They understand that they built this system to allow for appeals.
Yeah.
It has gotten overly complicated, and that's, I sort of alluded to that. That's a challenge. That's perhaps one reason why you don't see as many appeals.
But that's a challenge for someone like you, a practitioner like you, not the owner. That's not a headache that reaches them.
Exactly right. The more complex the system, the more difficult it is for people like me to navigate it. But that's our job, and it doesn't, in that sense, it doesn't increase the cost. The costs are the cost, and if it's a simple proceeding, that's fine. But if it gets very involved, like they often do in Ontario, then it's no additional work or cost for the taxpayer, because you're doing the work based on a fixed contingency fee. And really, the only cost, now, I said no fee. You have a appeal filing fee, but it's relatively nominal.
So going back to what we were talking about earlier, right, there's this drastic difference between what's happening in Ontario in terms of the number of people who choose to go into the appeal process versus what you saw during your time in Western Canada, where it just seems to be more ubiquitous. Do you feel like there's some sort of systemic gaps or changes that are needed in Ontario? And the reason I ask that is, on a more personal level, I remember getting a call from these investors from northeastern United States, and that's where they focus their investments. They were starting to look towards Canada as a potential next step for them, a new frontier. And we got on a call with them, and one of the first questions they asked was, are there any incentives or benefits to us as foreign investors coming into Canada, investing in these properties from a tax standpoint? And we had nothing to tell them. Like, there was nothing that really stood out as, hey, these are all the reasons why we've got a great property tax system here in Ontario. So, that's one thing, like appealing to investors and retaining investors. And then, are there other traits that the Ontario tax system can emulate, maybe from Western Canada, maybe from, things that are happening south of the border, to just make it a better system? What would you say about that?
Yeah, there's two components to your question. One is on the broader, property tax policy, property tax rate kind of situation. In other words, is commercial property treated in a fashion where property tax is, less of a burden, in that kind of generic sense. The other is, within the framework, within the system, are there things about Ontario that, make it a more difficult jurisdiction for people who own commercial property or contemplating owning commercial property here? And that's where I think that, dealing with the second piece first, and your comment about, what changes can be made, the starting point of that is, looking at what the problems or challenges are with the Ontario system. One is the very complex proceedings before the Assessment Review Board. And that contrasts with some of the Western Canadian jurisdictions, which have two levels of tribunal. One is much more informal. So there's a request for review process in Ontario, but in terms of going to an independent adjudicator, you only have the assessment review board, which is a very complicated procedural rules, a very complex system, and of course, as I referred to, representation has to be provided by people licensed by the Law Society. But, that's an issue there, just in terms of one example of the complexity in the system. The other would be the myriad property tax classes and subclasses and phase-ins and tax capping and clawback and all those different issues that we see in Ontario, many of which aren't typical in other provinces, especially when you look at Western Canada. So that's another consideration. And then even the industry here doesn't seem to have developed quite the same level of I don't know if aggression is the right word, but acceptance of the need to conduct appeals sort of on a routine basis. This is a check, right? So again, you don't at least do the reviews. And so when you look at the absolute numbers of appeals here in relative terms, they're much lower. So the culture, whether it's owners, not as insistent on having those reviews done, or whether it's people reviewing them not being as aggressive with their approaches, there's a difference between, as an example, Ontario and Western Canada
Right.
and how the business operates.
Yeah, so that's both, you're saying, a cultural and a systemic gap that causes that.
It does seem to be a function of both those. And then, the broader issue that you raised about, investing in this market, I think the biggest challenge, isn't so much the absolute amount of tax that's paid, although that is an issue, especially the delta between residential and commercial property tax rates. The bigger issue,
which is what I've heard, is close to 3x
it can
in
be,
Ontario.
it can be, yeah,
Yeah.
depending on the jurisdiction.
Uh-huh.
And double 2.5 times is pretty normative.
Right.
And so that's an issue. But the bigger issue, perhaps, especially for people looking at investing, and they have an opportunity to put their capital wherever they want, is the lack of certainty. And that's a real challenge. Like, how do you tell people what their tax are going to be when they're penciling out a deal, and you have no idea beyond really the next year, because you don't know when a reassessment will be, you don't know what the valuation date will be, and you don't know what tax policy measures might be implemented to mitigate the changes based on the reassessment.
Right. So there's no real sense of predictability at that point.
No, it's very challenging. I don't know, really coming up with a pro forma where you're looking at projecting taxes out more than a year or two is extremely difficult.
Right. Right. So what do you think do you think that the upcoming change in government, would that have any impact? Because I know that's part of the common conversation right now. Pierre Poilievre has commented on the fact that if he were to be elected, he would scale back the capital gains increase. Are there other changes that we can expect to see with the change in government?
Property tax is provincial.
Yeah.
So it isn't directly impacted by changes at the federal government level.
Mm-hmm.
The question is maybe what's the will in terms of the province. There's been a consultation underway, a consultation regarding the broader property tax assessment system in Ontario. It started in a somewhat smaller version, I would say, back in 2019, bit of a hiatus during COVID, and it's started again or being revitalized with a broader mandate this past fall of 2024. So they're looking at, I think, more aspects of the property tax assessment system. There's a variety of changes there, right? So, one I would say is reducing that delta between commercial and residential tax rates.
Mm-hmm.
That's a priority, and that can be addressed by the province. They can, mandate a certain ratio between the two. Another thing is simplifying the appeal system. I've alluded to that, and again, some changes are pretty straightforward in terms of how that system operates. But I mean, a lot of those are taxpayer driven, right? Because when you get to the board and when you have success and when you litigate property tax assessment matters, you get direction from the boards and from the courts, and it tends to work out some of the challenges over time. You get precedent decisions, You get the board and the courts understanding the problems and challenges that some of the legislation produces. That can be addressed by legislative change. That can be addressed by court decisions. So, there's ways that, by being proactive, that taxpayers can influence that process. Of course, lobbying is a big part of that as well. But on the whole, the legislation itself, the framework itself isn't the biggest challenge. It's sort of how it's being operated more recently. And I think that, that can be addressed in part by the boards themselves simplifying the process, perhaps by legislative change, but also, as I said, by taxpayers, expressing their concerns, whether through lobbying, whether during the course of hearings, appeal hearings, or generally just by being proactive in terms of how they approach their assessment review and make sure they take issue when they're not satisfied with the assessed values that their properties have received. So that's an important issue there. And then even structurally, I mean, when you look at the board of directors of MPAC, there's a way to make it more representative of the commercial property sector. I don't really believe it is now when you look at the people who are on the board of directors of MPAC. I don't think there's many of them who we can accurately say reflect the interest of commercial property owners and occupants of those properties in Ontario. I'm not saying none, but I think that ratio has to change and have more people sensitive to the requirements of commercial property owners in terms of how the system works and build efficiencies into the system. I think so. There's a lot of changes that can be made to make it operate more effectively in Ontario.
Right. And what would you say would be your kind of, passing message to property owners? What's the crux of the conversation that we've had today, and what would you recommend to them for people who are listening in?
Participate, and that starts by reviewing your own property tax assessment situation. It might even end there, right? Get the reviews done. If it's acceptable, then that's the end of it, and it's a simple process, right? Just hand it off to a professional. Where there's opportunities to achieve property tax savings, pursue them. And again, it's a complicated process, but you're passing it off to people who do it all day, every day. So your own personal involvement is really limited to passing along some information, things of that nature. You don't have to get caught up in it effectively. So that would be the initial recommendation. Then beyond that, I mean, there's a consultation underway, and many commercial property owners are involved with Build and NAOP and BOMA, RealPAC. Again, express your concerns there, but also listen to the people who are involved in government relations roles at those groups and see how you can assist and make sure that as a result of the ongoing provincial review of the property tax assessment system, changes that are made are favorable to commercial property owners, because the system now doesn't operate very well for that sector.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that's a welcome message for the vast majority. From going back, 1% of people are property owners are actually appealing these bills. So a lot of room for huge amounts of savings from what I'm hearing, and in some cases just finding out that your property is even exempt for property tax, and in other cases achieving significant reductions. I think that's well worth the effort, especially when the owners find themselves in a position where that's not something that they have to take on as a burden on their finances or on their time. Like at that point, it's sort of why wouldn't you? So I hope that's something that more people take up and participate in, and we also reduce that gap between that residential and commercial overburdening in terms of property taxes that commercial property owners are seeing. But in any case, it's been a pleasure chatting with you here today, Robert. Thank you so much for making time, and I look forward to doing this again in a few years, maybe after the assessments have been completed, and see where we find ourselves.
Yeah, hopefully the next reassessments will be sooner rather than later.
All right.
But yeah, really appreciate the opportunity to talk about property tax.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.